Hi, everyone. Wherever you are, good morning, good evening, or um, let me share my screen. I have a couple of slides. I'll be talking about the circular economy. It's a term that has become popular in the last few years. Um, can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Great. Um, so there is a lot of talk about the circular economy itself as a concept. Um, but there isn't a lot of talk about how to make it happen. Um, if you have heard or read articles about, yes, businesses like sharing cars and sharing houses is one approach. Absolutely. The more we utilize a particular asset, the better. Um, but it gets more complicated than that when we start thinking about how about actually reusing materials for a long time and stuff like that. So that's the part I'd like to talk about, I, especially with an audience like this, because it is a challenge. It is an engineering challenge, and it is a major engineering, not just in terms of technical engineering, but if we think of engineering as the broadest, uh, in the broadest sense of the word, how do we engineer a number of these ideas? With that in mind, so let me begin by saying, what if we actually had one pool of resources? Um, how could we go about? So in a linear economy, the idea is that we take resources, we make products, we use them, and then we discard them. But the concept of circular then comes from the possibility that we could still take some virgin materials, then we make products, use them, and then find a way to reuse the products themselves or the materials. In theory, if we could forecast the right amount of materials that we will ever need as a species, we could, in theory, stop taking. That is a challenge in and of itself, and that implies a number of things that many people don't want to get into, like what about population size? But even if we continue to take virgin materials, is it possible to take just a minimum to keep the system going, but mostly reuse materials and products? That is the question of the circular economy. This is a diagram from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation where they explain this. You may have also heard of concepts like biomimicry and or cradle to cradle. Nature already has, as we know, a natural cycle by which a lot of the organic compounds and even elements are continually reused in multiple cycles. The challenge is on the industrial side or the artificial side or the human side. How do we maintain the same molecules or the same types of energy within a cycle so that we stop taking more and more virgin materials? So while nature knows how to do it right, we need to figure it out. And that is the engineering challenge. How do we enable products to maintain as much material value as possible through multiple lives? And it gets more interesting because if we consider this blue line at the top to be the original product or piece of equipment, we know that there's natural wear and tear. That alone takes away some of the original value or functionality. At some point, that product is going to reach end of life. And the question is, first, how can we maintain the same product so that perhaps a second user can still make use of that product? That is really the first step. Ideally, asset reutilization, second lives, so on and so forth, are concepts around this idea. How do we enable the maximum longevity within internal groups and external? However, as we know, because there is some wear and tear, most likely we're going to have to change some components, maintain some parts. That implies that out of the same products, we may be able to reclaim some components to use in the same products to keep them going. But at some point, either the product or the materials or the parts are not going to meet the specs of the original product. So at that point, we may need to reconsider refurbishing or remanufacturing the parts themselves or the whole product altogether. And eventually, we may have to consider remanufacturing the materials themselves, and even go into concepts like recycle, where we try to really recover the value of the material. As we know, unfortunately, not all materials are 100% recyclable. In fact, people often say that instead of recycling, we downcycle some of these materials. And then, of course, there's energy recovery. At some point, we could burn some of these materials and at least recover the energy. Now, of course, as you can realize, the longer the path to recover molecules or energy, the more time, the more energy, and the more effort we need to invest for that recovery. So what are some of the challenges? As I mentioned, there are engineering challenges, but I'm using the word engineering in the broadest sense possible, because we need to rethink the business models that we use. We need to think about not just, the using the same car or the same house, but often how do we make sure that the same assets can be utilized in different ways, and also how to enable a second life, for instance. We need to think about materials. As we mentioned, not all materials are fully recyclable. Not all materials are easily compostable. And also when it comes to recovering them, that could be an issue as well. Potentially new manufacturing processes. For instance, 3D printing allows us now to build some parts, even products, on the spot where we need them. So using new technologies and processes like these actually help us reduce the total consumption of material and energy. New product development practices. Today, some companies make decisions in their engineering and product design processes about, for instance, the durability of a product. Why? Because they mostly think that that product is going to be used by one user for a number of months or years. And after that, why worry about what's going to happen to it next? So some of these practices need to change. Same as supply chain practices and players. Today, it is hard to say that one particular company is responsible for the entire supply chain. Yet, if there isn't one responsible or multiple responsible parties, then who makes the decisions about the product, the materials, the business model, etc.? And as I was mentioning, waste management practices. Today, unfortunately, it takes a lot of manual effort to take the waste from residential communities and from companies and put it apart, separate it, figure out what to do with it. Technology can help with that a lot. And some of those technologies have been developed already, but they're too expensive for many of these waste collection sites to implement. And new public policies. Whether we like it or not, unfortunately, sometimes regulations are good incentives to get all of this going. So we need to think about engineering new policies that way as well. So the question is, how can we all contribute? You know, for those who are still in school, or I'm sure a lot of your projects have an angle that could be incredibly helpful. Those of us like me who are already in industry and we want to rethink some of our businesses, what could we do to contribute? And I'll stop there and look at some questions. So I'm looking at the chat and I don't see any particular questions.
I'll ask a question.
Sure.
So, speaking out loud.
Please.
Very interesting, thank you. When I think about, the first thing I thought about when you started presenting is entropy, and how it seems like everything that humans do, everything that life does is about breaking things down in ways that are not repeatable. You know, we build more structure internally on Earth in our own homes and lives, but we're necessarily, if I'm remembering which direction entropy goes, we're increasing entropy outside. Is there some element of the way we live that is necessarily not renewable, not circular, and we just have to go as far as we can? Or is there a way to be truly, you know, fully circular? Or just any thoughts on that kind of way of thinking about it?
Thank you for the question. There is, at least to my knowledge, one area where it is really hard to fight entropy, and that is heat. I read an article years ago that the average temperature of Tokyo was steadily going up because Tokyo happens to be a very hot and humid place in the summer. And because the Japanese society has become wealthy over time, most people have air conditioning. But as we know, what we're doing really is taking the heat from inside apartments, and most Japanese live in small apartments. We're taking that heat out into the atmosphere. And then what do we do with that heat? So yeah, a lot of people are trying to figure out better air conditioning systems. But to my knowledge, there is no way to get out of that conundrum. We're taking heat from inside, putting it into the atmosphere, and that, of course, increases the outside temperature. What the scale of that is compared to the overall accumulation of CO2 in the atmosphere, I don't know. But that is one area where it is hard to say that, that there is a way to make it circular.
Thank you.
Thank you. I see a question here in the chat. Is there one industry that is farther along than others? Thank you for that question. I know of multiple examples of companies in different industries that are doing different things. I'm not aware of one particular industry where the entire supply chain has figured it out. For instance, if you're familiar with the work by Bill McDonough, for years, I remember even hearing him speak at MIT 20-some years ago. He talked about the concept of cradle to cradle and how some, for instance, carpet companies were already beginning to use, to recycle their own carpets and reusing that material for their own products. So that was a very long time ago. More recently, I am aware that Apple, because they have their take back program for iPhones, Apple is developing processes to try to recover some of the material from their own phones. I don't know to what extent that is economically feasible, or is it mainly that Apple has the resources to experiment with this for some time. As I mentioned, you know, ride sharing and house sharing industries offer the opportunity to use one asset over and over again, right? To utilize it more than what the typical user would do. Interestingly, they necessarily did not invent that concept either, because Xerox for years stopped selling copying machines in order to rent or lease copying machines. And my understanding is that they basically continually refurbish and upgrade copying machines by simply changing a few parts instead of having to change the entire copying machine altogether all the time. Other industries, for instance, like construction, they're beginning to look at cement, for instance. How can they recover, construction material after a building has been demolished and reuse that for cement? And there are even ideas of 3D printing small size rooms. So there are a few ideas out there, but to my knowledge, there isn't one industry that has figured it out just yet. I don't see other questions in the chat.
What about countries where the lack of privileges has made them be very resourceful in reusing and keeping some of the normally, more disposable items from people, for example, automobiles in Cuba or automobiles in third world countries that are maintaining a life of their own with minor modifications and continuing to be in use?
Absolutely. Thank you for the question. Myself, I'm originally from Mexico, and I can tell you that my parents have had the same fridge for 40 years. Perhaps products used to be more durable before. Now, as we know, some companies introduce, as is called, planned obsolescence. But certainly there are products that their duration, their durability is maybe much longer than what we in the West, or in the US at least, think could be or should be. That makes me think also of situations where, for instance, well-intentioned organizations go around the world and try to implement a technology to help, I don't know, clean water or bring water or carry water. And then it turns out that the parts themselves are not available locally. So to the extent that we can think about, as I mentioned, one of the challenges is product development processes. To the extent that we can think about these future lives and future possibilities so that we enable others to maintain the products with local resources, I think that is absolutely fantastic. And personally, again, because I was not born here in the US, I know that it is important for us outsiders or people from other parts of the world to help Western product designers think about these use cases, where in other parts of the world, we certainly find use for products much beyond the originally intended use.
And I mean, your talk is very interesting in many ways because it makes you think about the history. And for example, how rubber, which was used in tires, was then applied to shoes. And then now the West is also doing that, whereas in the past it wasn't. So it was a technology that was taken on by a third world country when they didn't have anything else, and they reintroduced it. There are many, many examples of things like that. And right now, the other industry in some ways that is innovative in reusing things is the food industry, where the waste is one of the biggest issues.
Correct. Yes, and my personal opinion on some of these things is that, and I'm looking at the next question, which I think points to that. The question itself is in the chat: do you think the most movement will be by businesses, business trader groups, or government regulations, consumer demand, or nonprofits? I feel that innovation could or should come from many angles. Certainly, large corporations today are talking about some of them. For instance, plastic, as we know, is a big issue in oceans. And the Ellen MacArthur Foundation is actually trying to convene a number of chemical companies and consumer product companies so that they have conversations about how do we re-engineering plastics so that we can reuse them and keep them from going to the oceans. But I think that if we teach some of these basic principles to many people around the world, people will find their own solutions, and they may come up with better solutions. As you said, Mina, there are a number of items or products that were used by communities around the world that were discarded later for the benefit of buying the products from overseas. But we could certainly reconsider what the older products were for their organic value, or for their circular value, or for their environmental benefit value overall. I see another question. Do you think society needs to make a structural change from consumer buying to keep the economy strong to another way to keep the economy strong? Thank you for that question. When I was at MIT, I can't remember the name of the professor, unfortunately, but in one of the classes I took, the question was presented as a problem. We think that the economy needs to be growing, and there is an argument for that. The economy needs to keep growing because population keeps growing, and therefore the economy needs to stay ahead in order to produce all the products and services that the new society is going to need, the new population. What happens when population slows down? Do we need to stop producing as many products and services? Or do we just increase the quality of the products and services? Or do we create new technologies that create new services altogether, even if our material needs are already met? So personally, I believe there is a way, and by the way, this is an important question because many of the naysayers will say, oh, no, every time you try to improve the environment, you're controlling what I can buy, and it's not true. We can keep an economy going and growing without continuously taking more virgin materials from nature. And that's why personally, I find that to be the amazing engineering challenge. How do we enable economic growth while maintaining the same pool of material and energy resources? So the trick is in the loop. Can we keep the loop going? Can the loop be efficient so that it continues to meet all the material and energy needs without taking more from nature? I see another question. I don't think we should assume third world countries will always be less advanced than Western countries, nor that their technologies will always be restricted to what an artisan can find in his or her backyard. Consider South Korea and Taiwan. They were dirt poor in the 50s, and now they have more advanced IC fabs than any Western country. Absolutely, absolutely. And that's what I meant by my earlier comment, that those of us who come from other countries can help designers in the US and in Europe see that there is potential and ideas everywhere. And certainly, I hope and I wish that more countries get involved because, as I mentioned, the key challenge here is innovation. So the more minds that are put to innovate a better economy, a circular economy, the better. So absolutely, we need to break paradigms in all kinds of areas. I'm looking at the next question here in the chat. What is the economist's definition of a growing economy? More stuff, more income, better standard of living, feel something. Yeah, good question. So in the 20th century, someone asked the question, right? How do we know that a country is doing well? And I can't remember the name of the person, but someone in the government said growth, domestic product, you know, oh, okay, GDP. Great. So they came up with a term. They figure out that if they could measure all economic activity, that would be a measure of the health of a country. And unfortunately, as we know, for the rest of the 20th century, that became the metric to use. As we know now, there is a push for thinking about a more holistic metric or a more holistic set of metrics that take into account well-being overall. In fact, some people have argued that, you know, GDP by itself could be improved simply if we remove those activities that actually represent a negative effect on society. For instance, here in California, where we have so many fires, we have to continually rebuild houses and buildings and other things. So that should not be added to the GDP, because while certainly it is economic activity, we're not showing the damage that was done to society and the environment and economy. In other words, the more you destroy, the more you rebuild, the better it sounds like, according to GDP. So definitely moving away from pure GDP is a good thing. And countries around the world are already looking at that. Yes, some countries talk about happiness. There is, my understanding, there is actually like a health index that tries to look at these things. The United Nations Sustainable Development Goals themselves try to look at a number of metrics. Personally, I think it's a little bit complex. Perhaps we can find 1 to 5 core metrics that help us. And if we institute that around the world, or if we as citizens of the globe start demanding our governments to measure well-being instead of just economic output, I think that would be fantastic. Patricia, I think I'm right about.
Yes. Thank you so much, Esteban. That was wonderful and great questions.
Thank you. I appreciate the participation, and thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah. Thank you.